Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. Today, I'm just delighted to have the privilege to be joined by Dr. Cam Clousing and Dr. Gregory Parker Jr., both of whom are responsible for two recent translations from Herman Bavinck. The first being Guidebook for Instruction in the Christian Religion. Actually, I should say, I guess only Gregory Parker is responsible for both of them. Dr. Clousing, I think, I think you only get credit for this one, but Dr. Parker gets the two. So, but we're Christians, we share glory, and that's what we're going to do here today.
Well, I'm happy for Cam to get as much credit on the second one as he wants.
I did write a recommendation for your book, Greg. So
it's true. Yeah, I'm not sure if it sells at all without that endorsement. So.
I'm pretty sure it doesn't.
The economy of scholarly back scratching and the debt ratios are very hard to keep track of.
It's a mutual admiration society here.
That's right. Well, it's a delight to talk to both of you. You know, Dale and I have tried since we've started the podcast to kind of keep up to date in Bavinck studies and the things that are coming out. And one of the things that when I was reading Eglinton's biography of Bavinck, what you see in that biography, of course, is all of these books get mentioned that you sort of have never heard about. And you get excited about, like, oh, wow, Bavinck wrote a 200-page book about teenagers. That sounds interesting. And two of them that were actually very interesting to me was this mention of a guidebook, a sort of a shorter version of the dogmatics that's even sort of another order of magnitude shorter than Our Reasonable Faith. And likewise, this idea that Bavinck contributed something to the 19th century essence of Christianity debate. So all that's just fascinating to me, and it was so exciting to see these books come out. And maybe, just as a way of, maybe we'll start with what is Christianity. It would be interesting, I suppose, to frame this in terms of what is that 19th century background that Bavinck is writing within. That is to say, it seems like there's all these books in the 19th century called "What is Christianity?" The Essence of Christianity, or something like this. And it seems like Bavinck's title is coming in sort of late. I mean, after a lot of books are written with a similar title, and there's some there's some resonance, it seems, between the way he's framing this book and a larger discussion of Christianity in the 19th century. Is there a way of, I guess, making that clear? What is he trying to accomplish, I suppose, with that particular text?
Yeah. So there's actually two essays in that book, What is Christianity? The first one is the later one, actually, so it kind of works chronologically backwards, I suppose. Which was a 1912 text. And that one is really his contribution to the discussion itself. And he's really trying to say Christ is Christianity. And it's kind of part of a larger book series that this Dutch publisher that he was working with was putting out called The Great Religions. Actually, his buddy Snooky wrote the one on Islam. And so... Yeah, so it's partially part of this kind of publishing movement. They're trying to expose the Dutch publishers or the Dutch public to all the various religions that are on the a la carte menu. But at the same time, it is this contribution to the discussion where he's really trying to cement Christ as being a historic figure and Christ as being the Christ of Scripture, and really trying to in a 66 pages, I think is what Warfield, the original Dutch version was, that Warfield commented on. In 66 short pages, he really maps this historic retelling of what Christianity is. And I think probably remarkably at the end, as a Dutch Reformed thinker, Calvinist, excuse me, you almost expect him to tell you that we have to think about Reformed theology as the correct rendition of theology. But his retelling is quite broad and ironic and kind, and he's really not throwing too many punches. I mean, he gets the Catholics a few times. But it's also, like you said, participating in this larger modern theology discussion. He's responding partially to Hegel and Harnack and to Feuerbach, but it's all much more, you kind of have to be aware that discussion's even happening as you're reading it to catch those notes of it, because it's really for the non-academic. That's who he's writing for.
Right. So. It's interesting that Harnack, you mentioned Harnack. It's interesting when he's writing about Christianity, even if I think by instinct, if sort of evangelical Protestants were to try and cast a wide net as to sort of what unites all of Christendom together, my tendency might be to say something like, think about the Council of Nicaea or something like that. But one of the kind of interesting movements it seems like Bavinck is making in this essay is also to ask what unites sort of Christians who were in pre-creedal times. Christianity split up fairly early. What is it that makes us able to say they're Christians? And what is it that makes us able even to speak about a sort of Christianity? He'll even mention sort of modern Christianity. And Harnack is sort of like, here's an example of what's going on in modern Christianity. And the scope with which he's painting the answer to the question of Christianity is really fascinating, because it's not it doesn't seem to be against sort of the crucialness of the creed in defining Christianity, but his scope in sort of defining what is this reality seems to be broader than sort of those who agree with the creed, which sort of fascinated me. I mean, it's on the one hand, he's making this move, you're right, of not just going straight to saying, and Reformed is the truth. Right. But it's also he's almost going, if he's being scary by not doing that, he's being scary all the way down. Right. Because he's trying to capture Christianity within such a large scope. And I wonder, maybe you could comment on this, is there a way in which the book could be called, the way he's defining Christianity as sort of something like it is Christ and the Christian life and Christian doctrine, but it's almost what gets all of those things included is the effects of Christ in the world. That what is Christianity? It is also this movement that has actually affected civilization in this way. And so towards the end, he has this interesting moment about mission. Christian civilization is important because it's uniquely adequated to man. And has therefore contributed something to humankind, without which he almost expects the decline of Christianity would be the decline of actually some cultural offering even. Is that, I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah. So I think part of his retelling is he's trying to open up the reader to the idea that the phenomena of Christianity is itself an apologetic, that it still exists, that it's still churning along in culture. I think he kind of appeals to Augustine in this way. And then I think at the end of The City of God, Augustine says it's actually quite remarkable that these, uneducated disciples ended up changing the world. And Bavinck really kind of draws upon that argument to say, like, can we really look at what the church has done because of and in light of Christ and not say, well, you kind of have to now grapple with who Christ is. And so I think that's the slight apologetic that comes through or is pulled through of the book. And if that second essay works as a kind of a perfect carry-on of that, it's that the first essay, the 1912 one, looks at the phenomena of Christianity, and which is Christ himself, Bavinck would say. And then the second essay, which was written in 1883, right at the start of his academic career, really looks at kind of more of that creedal, because he's expositing the Apostles' Creed. So we go from the phenomena of Christianity to the essence of Christianity. And so at some point, some doctoral student will connect all the dots between those two essays, but I think that's pretty fascinating.
Speaking of doctoral students, one of the things since Dr. Klausing, since you're on the podcast, I would love to segue actually into not that you're a doctoral student, you've graduated, obviously. It's actually Gregory who just graduated, right? Yes,
this is true.
Congratulations, Dr. Parker.
Thank you.
But
finally, the Bavinck Institute has recognized it now.
Yeah, that's right.
It's now official.
We recognize everyone. We never recognize your doctorates. That's you're welcome. Yeah, that's right. But the subject of your dissertation, Cam, was Bavinck and his relationship to history, and one of the or it had something to do with historicism in Bavinck, if I recall. One of the things that's fascinating in the essay, What is Christianity, is precisely that Bavinck is he's trying to see Christ's significance and tying together a whole host of time. It is a history of Christianity, but there's a way in which Christ himself unifies the history itself, unifies the time of Christianity. And one of the quotes that I've encountered in Bavinck that perhaps shaped my thinking more than any other is this famous, I say famous to Bavinck people, this famous quote in Philosophy of Revelation where Bavinck just riffs on Christ being the center of history. The idea that you really can't find a way in which to organize or distribute history and all of its meaning in parts without the centerpiece that is Christ. So actually, I'm sort of exploiting things here. This was supposed to be about these two books, but I would love to ask that just for those, because we're nerding out about Bavinck a little bit here. When is your work going to be available, and what is your sort of overall argument? What in effect is your thesis in your work, so that people can look forward to this? Because it's one of those subjects Bavinck writes about, historical revelation even. He does all this stuff that's interesting with history, and nobody's written about it, and you have, and I think it's great. And I want people to there.
Yeah. I mean, so that quote that you referenced is actually a quote, him riffing on the philosopher of history, Rudolf Eucken. I can never remember how to pronounce his name. But Bavinck is really actually quite influenced by both him and Dilthey when it comes to his understanding of history. And so it's just really a fascinating subject. But I'm working on finishing up my manuscript. I'll have it into Oxford hopefully at the end of this year. I'm contracted to have it into them at the end of this year. So, and then who knows how long it'll take to get through the editing process. But hopefully sometime next year, the book will actually be out and available through Oxford University Press. So, I don't remember if that was the full extent of the question, but it's a fascinating topic, and I think that this is like with what is Christianity. I think that what Bavinck does with history. I was having a conversation with Simon Kennedy, who teaches in Brisbane, and he teaches intellectual history, and he's just written a paper on Bavinck in history. And we were kind of going back and forth for a bit about what is the influence, what influence is Bavinck experiencing, like where is Bavinck finding his understanding of history, and Simon wanted to argue that it's Hegel, and I said I'm just not convinced that it's Hegel, though there are Hegelian streams there with some of what Bavinck says. A lot of what Bavinck is doing is actually I think feeding off of Augustine and Augustine's understanding of how history works, with Christ being the center and everything else kind of rippling out from Christ. I mean, once again, as you read City of God, this is kind of how Augustine understands the flow of history, that Christ is the centerpiece, the middle point of history, and everything kind of flows out from that. And I think to the extent that Bavinck is borrowing from Hegel, it's because Hegel is borrowing from Augustine in his understanding of history on these things, and thus he finds people like Dilthey actually quite helpful for understanding how history works, because Dilthey is I think also influenced by Plato and Augustine and their understandings of how history moves forward. So I think that one of the things that you can trace throughout all of Bavinck's work is this strong indebtedness to Augustinian thinking and Augustine on a lot of stuff. But at the same time, because Bavinck is, I argue that Bavinck is influenced by historicism, 19th century historicism, the 19th century being the time where history as a science in its own right becomes a science. Up to that point, history was used always for the purpose of kind of, and here's the moral lesson that we get from history. When we get to the 19th century, for the first time, you have history being told as if you're an objective observer of it, and you can actually say the way it is or the way it happened, and thus what all of part of the whole essence of Christianity question then becomes is tied to that historicism question. Like, okay,
right.
Not only how do we understand scripture, but then, okay, what is the kernel? What is the seed that is the essence, the very thing that can't be changed in Christianity? And I think to some degree we still ask this question. It's a question that even to this day we still have a lot of conversations with people about. And in fact, when you think about I live on a busy, or I work on a busy street. So if you heard the horns,
no worries. Sounds from across the world. It's beautiful.
The horns in Australia sound different than the horns in America. But as one of the things that's amazing, I think, even like how Bavinck, as I kind of think about like Greg's translation, and then I think about what we did with Guidebook. And then as I think about how people are even resourcing Bavinck now, one of the questions that has been kind of rolling around in the back of my head is that question of the essence of Christianity, and kind of picking up on missiology and some missiology conversations that are happening, particularly with somebody like Andrew Walls, who puts together the whole idea of a pilgrim principle of Christianity and an indigenizing principle of Christianity, wherein when Christianity encounters a new culture, there's certain things about Christianity that cannot be changed, and certain things about Christianity that have to be changed because they're encountering a new culture, and these things, and Christianity isn't like Islam, where you go into a culture and it has to be exactly the same no matter where it is. And I think Bavinck is still starting to toy with this idea when it comes to how he understands theology, how he understands historicism. I mean, this is a big part of historicism, that in fact things change and grow and progress over time. And thus that's why, I mean, part of the reason why the essence of Christianity question comes up is because things have progressed since the first century. So what holds Christianity together anymore? And I think that it's a question that we're still asking as we kind of come into the 21st century.
Yeah.
What is the pilgrim principle that has to remain the same, and what are the indigenizing principles of Christianity?
That's really fascinating, because you get the sense when you read this, of course, that it's a text that clearly couldn't have been written outside of the modern world. Partially, you mentioned the rise of history becoming a science in its own. This is also, the rise of religious studies. This is when religion as a category, and the way we use it now, as I'm sure you guys are aware, becomes a category, and we begin to start studying Christianity and Islam. And this is in a series of books on what is Christianity, what is Islam, and as Gregory put it, like, we all experience that as sort of a buffet. And within each of those categories, once you're pulling back and looking at it in a phenomenological way, each of the boxes are just so big. And one of the things that's interesting in this book that I'd love to hear y'all's comments on are the I suppose to some Protestant sentiments, the shocking suggestion that the division of the church, Catholic and Protestant, currently is still almost portrayed as a sort of judgment on Christian lack of charity. Actually, that if, inverting the comment, almost actually that if Christians actually learn to love better, somehow you would see some reunification of the church. And it seems like later Bavinck does begin to have an eyeball, again, just as he has an eyeball on sort of what does it mean to project Christianity into the modern world. There's this eyeball on what will the 20th century ecumenical project be. He's seeing these developments in Roman Catholicism, and he seems toward the end of his life almost anticipating I'm going to use the phrase almost a kind of reformed ecumenicity, but not in any of the maybe loosey-goosey way that can mean something later in the 20th century. I don't know. I guess I'm curious what you all think he's doing sort of within the larger Christian community toward the end of his life, or how he's imagining his project relating, as it were, to Protestants relating to Catholics in the modern world and this sort of thing. Yeah.
Bruce Pass in his book on theology, which was a translation of a bunch of academic speeches that Bavinck gave. I think the introduction to that is fascinating. And Bruce kind of walks through how Bavinck's approach to culture changes a bit, where in his early days, he was much more interested in kind of drawing lines in the sand or creating dikes between him and other faith communities in order to kind of establish, okay, this is who we are as, the seceders and who we are as this group of people doing theology. And then Pass really traces out how by the end of Bavinck's academic career, and I think he does so quite persuasively, Bavinck's much more interested in kind of building bridges and connecting faith communities and saying, all right, like actually to approach modernity, to approach the issues that we have onsetting us, we kind of have to have a united front. And I think this essay on Christianity is a great example of that, of Bavinck really trying to persuasively present Christianity as this beautiful thing and not as this thing with 1,000 different divisions and chasms within it. And I think secondly to that, I think within neo-Calvinism, there is this idea that diversity is inherently not a bad thing. It's kind of drawing on Babel, that the Tower of Babel was a way for God to continue his plan, not really it's not the bad thing that we make it out to be, so to say. And so this diversity of within the church is not as bad as it has to be. It's actually a good way of the church moving forward and finding itself into different communities, kind of what Cam was suggesting with Andrew Walls. But
that's a
Cam,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Cam, I'd love to hear your thoughts though on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, one of the things to remember is that I think that by the beginning of the 20th century, Bavinck had kind of started seeing a lot of what, not to pit Bavinck against Kuyper, but a lot of Kuyper's project as kind of a failed project at this point. Like like he realized that they weren't going to keep the Netherlands reformed and Christian in the sense that it had been in the 19th century. And once again, this goes back to I think some of this goes back to Bavinck's understanding of historicism. Perhaps it's just because I did my PhD on it.
Because this is the only theme in Bavinck now. It's always.
I mean, it's like my goal is for everybody to write their PhDs about historicism and forget the organic motif and go like, no, actually, it's historicism. This is the unifying motif in Bavinck.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
No, I mean, I think some of it is just Bavinck understood that there is no golden age of Christianity to go back to. And thus, I mean, this is his introduction to the first edition of the Reformed Dogmatics. It's his introduction to his work on the Leiden Synopsis. It's his introduction to Magnalia Dei, where he basically just says, "Look, times have changed. There are new questions that are being asked, and we need to provide new answers to those questions." They're answers that are still rooted in the historic faith and in what we've historically believed. But they're new questions and they're new challenges to the faith, and thus that means that we have to approach it differently. And I think that's the same thing then when it comes to his cultural questions. I mean, why all of a sudden is he becoming more ecumenical in a good way? Because he realizes that in the end, like if we want to continue to see the society reach for the gospel, we need to find co-belligerence in some of these cultural questions that we may not agree with everything, but we agree on this particular issue. So how can we unite around it? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's in some ways it's very much a I know this is not the case necessarily here in my context, but I know inside the American context, this might be a tricky comment to make. In some ways, this is very much one could see the influence of a liberalism in Bavinck's thought in this way, and that he's kind of saying, okay, how can we build large coalitions for the as opposed to having our own little groups that are segmented off in society, trying to force society to go a particular way, but going like, okay, how do we build these coalitions of co-belligerents to see certain things that we all agree need to be changed in society? So there's a liberal streak.
Orthodox but modern Bavinck.
Or even
to coin a phrase, if you will.
Yes, it's the and of course that's the real central theme is Orthodox but modern. That's really pulls it all together in Bavinck. It would be interesting to see somebody, in fact, I would think, write a just as one could almost write Bavinck as sort of an original, sort of ecumenist. It would be interesting to write of him as an original theorist of diversity, because that is a really interesting theme. I mean, as you mentioned that this is part of neo-Calvinism, but it's interesting to see that even though in what is Christianity, again, there is a sense that part of what the phenomena of Christianity is the cultural phenomena of Christianity, which still incubates a little bit in a Harnack despite himself, that sort of thing. And yet it's not Europe-centric. The way he's writing, he's kind of speaking of a Christendom of sorts, but it's a wider Christendom. It's not defined as, it's not reducible to Europe. And Bavinck does seem to have this expectation that you just mentioned, Cam, that wherever Christianity goes, it only opposes sin. It doesn't oppose creation, and presumably every nation has its own vantage points and insights, and that the final galaxy brain hot take, if we could put it that way, is going to involve what is pre-contained in all, not just the world of men and women, but all nations, or all gifts, all callings, all personalities, that sort of thing. It would be very interesting, I think, to see work like that done. Just to say something about Guidebook, I had the privilege of using this at Bavinck. I taught a class called The Desire of Every Nation, which was, you might say, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Neoplatonist, and a perennialist philosopher walked into a bar and talked to each other. And Bavinck was my Protestant. It's because really goes through the whole Christian faith. I should hold this up because we got free copies. It looks like this, everybody. But he goes through the whole Christian faith, and we sort of paired him over against the Catholic and over against the sort of the perennialist philosopher, and went through sort of what does it look like to speak about sin and redemption from a kind of natural philosophical perspective, or from this Reformed Protestant perspective. And he was the best, I must say. Your translation of Bavinck did in fact win out in the Platonic dialogue. I neatly reconstructed out of his speaking part in this book. But a fascinating text. What was the context in which, so he writes, obviously, Reformed Dogmatics, 2 editions, one that's, Bavinck 1.0, one that's a little bit Bavinck 2.0, even though there's organic continuity between those, of course. Then Our Reasonable Faith, but toward the end, he writes this shorter text. What's kind of the goal of reducing what was formerly 2,500 pages of dogmatics into 180 pages? What's he trying to accomplish there?
Once again, you just got just thinking about the context in which he's writing, he realizes that the Reformed Dogmatics is not written for everyone. I think this is one of the issues inside of theological writing these days, and inside of the consumption of theological writing. We have this view that everything needs to be ecumenical, or not ecumenical, egalitarian. That's the word I'm looking for. And that everybody, it all has to be equally grasped. And if I'm reading something that's if I'm reading something, and it should be just as accessible to the average person in my church that hasn't actually got a theology degree, or even to my pastor. So if I'm reading Reformed Dogmatics, I know a lot of pastors that just are going to look at that and go, this is a really tough read. And it is a really tough read. It assumes a lot of knowledge because it's a scientific theology. So I think that the first thing that we realize when we come to something like Guidebook is the fact that Bavinck didn't write all of his works as egalitarian works. They weren't for everyone. So the Reformed Dogmatics wasn't for everyone, and it's not something that I would actually recommend to most people in my churches. When we get to something like Magnalia Dei, the wonderful works of God. He's writing that once again, not for everyone, but for the educated layperson in your church, probably has a college or university education, and it's a great work that's accessible to that level. But then he also realizes, once again, like, this isn't for everyone, and there needs to be something that's for our young people in our churches as they're getting ready to graduate from high school and go into the university. He's once again in the early 20th century in the Netherlands, where the universities aren't going to help secure the faith anymore. And so what does he do? He says, okay, well, how do we help prepare them? Well, we've done catechism, so how do we go deeper into a catechetical understanding of our theology? And he writes guidebook, a short 20 chapter book that he then is able to use as a tool to train up young people as they get ready to leave high school and go into university. So I mean, I think that at a very base level, one of the things that's really great about having these three works out is that it just reminds us that actually you don't need to write every work for every person, and not every person actually needs to read everything that's put out there. There's a place for people to write to popularize academic works, and there's a place for academic works that are just speaking to the academy.
Yeah. Was there something that surprised each of you in translating Guidebook? Because, of course, it's a late book and a lot of the paragraphs come from wonderful works of God, but then there's these new paragraphs that are late Bavinck. Was there anything that, in translating, you're like, ooh, that's delicious, or surprising, or I don't know, that stood out to you, intrigued you?
I'll give my answer. I'll give my quick answer. My quick answer is always the fact that Bavinck says in chapter 20 that we won't have stomachs in heaven.
No.
Which I'm trying to still figure out how we feast at the marriage supper of the Lamb if we don't have stomachs. But
yeah, interesting. Is that an old? Is that part of his scholastic inheritance? Is there like church historical precedent for that claim? I know there's this in scholasticism. There's this whole grammar of what the resurrected body is like, and I'm not adept enough with it to know exactly if that pings it or not. That's interesting, though. No stomachs in heaven. He was confident about this.
I think it's just a poor reading of 1 Corinthians 6. Yeah. I don't recall what the Dutch version of the Bible, the Statenvertaling, says about it, but I think he's just reading that verse or recalling it poorly and thinking we don't have stomachs.
We don't have stomachs in heaven. Well,
yeah, it's a nice line though to remember when someone says to you, like, Greg, you've done your PhD on Bavinck. Is there anything you disagree with him on? You can say, well, I think we're gonna have stomachs.
We don't have stomachs in heaven. Yes.
I think maybe interestingly, comparing the two volumes, that 20th chapter is, I think, significantly longer than the rest of them. And so that really struck me going through it. I think most of them, have like 16, 18 paragraphs, and that one has like 45. Yeah. I think the Trinity chapter is the next longest. So those two kind of stood out to me. And in a time where people really aren't thinking a ton about eschatology, Bavinck's got 45 paragraphs devoted to it in this little book. It's also not as much caught up into certain arguments, so that's kind of interesting. It's very streamlined at the same time.
Chapter was so striking. When I went through it with the students, we're reading it next to Thomas Joseph White, our Catholic interlocutor, and our perennialist philosopher interlocutor. But Bavinck does spend relative to the other chapters, a significant amount of time on eschatology. But it's it's a beautiful chapter in a lot of ways. It can, and especially I think it's an interesting time because, of course, he's writing in a time when dispensational eschatology is sort of becoming all the rage. But he's not. It's sort of excitement about eschatology in the teens that isn't dispensationalist. Pop excitement. Very fascinating chapter. That's an interesting one. Yeah, he ends more.
Yeah, and I think in general, kind of Protestant anthropology rests on certain eschatological readings, and so it's. I think in a volume oriented towards teenagers, it's really helpful in processing who are we, where are we heading, to have an extended chapter on that. And that's the other the historical tidbit to recall is that his daughter Hannah or Hanny This would have been published right about the time that she would have been able to read it, I believe. I can't recall exactly what her age was at the time, but I think it's pretty much she was a teenager at this time, I think. So he's really writing with his daughter in mind in certain ways, which is a fascinating way to view the book.
What as we sort of move toward a close here, what I have just a question about why. I guess it's a two-part question, and maybe you both can answer this. Why these texts? There's an enormous amount of Bavinck text to translate still, and so anytime you're picking a Bavinck text, you're picking one out of a bunch that could be selected. What attracted you, I guess, to these particular texts? And then I guess the next question then becomes, what's next? What do you guys either even if you're not working on a translation now, what do you hope will be translated, or what are you excited that is being translated, even if not by you guys? Obviously not by Cam, because he only translates one, and it's great that he translates all the book.
Well, I think if I can answer partially for both of us, years ago when Cam and I first met at an ETS, we had this discussion about translating some Bavinck together and teaming up and really kind of collecting our forces, I guess, and synergizing a bit. And one thing that we really agreed on was the desire to see a focus on the pastoral or the more ecclesially oriented Bavinck. And so our translations have all been oriented in this kind of accessible direction. So we started with the Sacrifice of Praise in 2019. Which is really about that time between being baptized and before you've taken the Lord's Supper, and kind of processing what does it mean to confess your faith. And then we moved on to Guidebook shortly thereafter, really with this idea, I think, of just catechizing the next generation of believers in the church. So that's kind of the heart behind these projects, which is why they're devoted to or dedicated to the children in our lives. I don't have 10 kids. These are my friends' kids, but Cam does have 2 kids.
Oh, I thought you were about to say Cam has 10 kids. That's that's a lot of kids. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really have much more to say that Greg hasn't said. I think one of the things that for me, as I kind of thought about the two texts that Greg and I have translated together, they're just texts that I think are for the church. Not that the other ones aren't that have been translated, but they're ones that are going to be read widely. Try saying that 10 times fast, because they're accessible. I mean, I've got I was just talking to a church in just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and my family and I will be back in the States for Christmas. And they asked me, the church asked me if I'd come speak to their youth, because their youth are reading through Guidebook together.
Wow.
For their
That's
youth
great.
group. And I said I'd love to. But I think that's really the goal there. Like for both Guidebook and Sacrifice of Praise, our goal was to see young people be able to pick up and read good theology in a time where not a lot of systematic theology is written for them. Not a lot of, and here in both Guidebook, Sacrifice of Praise, What is Christianity, you have a master of theology doing everything he can to make his theology as accessible as possible, and I appreciate that. And he becomes for me, I don't consider myself a master of theology like he was, but he becomes an example for me and reminding me, like, I can write to the academy, but I also need to always have the church in mind and how I'm writing. So for me, that's been kind of the big payoff has been when I hear of teenagers being given Sacrifice of Praise as a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. When I hear youth groups are picking up Guidebook and using it for their theology, for studying theology and talking through theology, like those are, I hope that people in the academy use it for whatever research they want to use it for, but I could care less about that. It's the young person in the church that's being formed in their faith that I get really excited about.
That's awesome.
So what's next? Well, both Greg and I mean, I'm contracted for my OUP book that'll come out hopefully next year. And then Greg and I are contracted to retranslate Magnalia Dei, the wonderful works of God.
Oh, wow.
Westminster did a great job with their republication of the old translation. There are a lot of issues.
Okay.
We say this in the introduction to Guidebook. There are a lot of issues with the publication, as well as missing parts and paragraphs that have been dropped
I
out.
don't know why I didn't hear about this before I bought it. So,
so we're contracted with Hendrickson to produce a new translation of that.
great.
Our goal with that, I might get us in trouble for saying this. So our goal with that is to do a lot more cross-referencing between Guidebook, Magnalia Dei, and Reformed Dogmatics to make it super usable for somebody to go, okay, I've read this in this text. Where can I find it in this text? And where does Bavinck expand it in that text and stuff like that? So we started doing a little bit of that work with Guidebook, but we want to do something that's much more fleshed out in Magnalia Dei.
Okay, that's excellent. And did I hear through the rumor mill that somebody is also translating Bavinck's book on teenagers? He writes this other work on teenagers, and I thought I heard through the rumor mill somebody's working on that as well.
I know James is.
Yeah, I believe James has
yeah.
started to. I think other projects have taken over at the moment, but
Okay.
It's at least in a Word document somewhere.
Okay. Well, when my teenagers are out of the house, then I'll get Bavinck's advice, and that's when it goes wrong, I'll just blame that it wasn't out yet.
Right.
Blame it on James. That's my most things. Anytime that I mess up on something, I blame it on James. Anytime I succeed, I don't give him any credit.
As all graduate students are wont to do to their supervisors. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and talking about these things. I especially appreciate your comment, Cam, about really the heart of both of you to want to take kind of Bavinck the pastor, taking all of this rich theology that we're all discovering, but then find those texts where he pulls it all together and delivers it to ordinary folks. And in fact, I find, when I read somebody like, my two kind of patron saints are, in as much as a Protestant can have patron saints, are Herman Bavinck and C.S. Lewis. And one of the reasons, there's a similarity there, in fact, that Lewis consolidates this enormous tradition, but really what makes Lewis is that he can deliver it with such whimsical prose that's for ordinary persons. And that delivery, and this is another thing about this guidebook, is that translation from dogmatics to the ordinary person is not what's shocking is it's not a reduction. And in fact, there's a kind of layer of insight, a layer of livingness that becomes more potent in a way when you see it all put in such plain terms. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Kelly Kapic did the book launch here in Australia last week, and he said something that I've thought a lot about. I've thought about it before, but haven't been able to say it in the same way that Kelly can, because he's Kelly Kapic and I'm just Cameron Clousing. But Kelly just made the comment of saying there's something about being able to move from complexity to simplicity without it becoming simplistic. And he talked about this particular work. He's like, you can see the complexity behind this work if you know it, but it's simple for most people. Exactly. Without it being simplistic answers to complex questions.
Yeah.
So it's been something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about since Kelly said it, and I think it really does sum up a lot of what's happening in Guidebook.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for all of your work and what you're doing. This is really exciting. I'm glad to have others pointed to your work and to follow Dr. Clousing, this book coming out. Gregory, you also just published your dissertation. Is that, do you have any anticipation of publishing that as well? Where can people look to find your work?
I will at some point. I haven't started seeking out
it's only been 15
yet,
minutes, so
yeah.
you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, so I will in due time, and I'm sure I'll email just you. I won't let Dale know since he snubbed us today.
Dale.
But
Dale skipped out on us today. Yeah, shame on him. He doesn't love Bavinck enough. Well, thanks again, gentlemen. Great to see you. For our listeners, obviously you can find us on all the podcast catchers. Usually Dale does this part and has a whole speech, and I since he's abandoned me, I don't know how to end it. But come back and see us next time.